and welcome to Dialogue. Nearly 1 month after it was elected to run the world's sixth largest economy in a landslide victory in early July, the new UK Labour government, led by Keir Starmer, declared the nation was broke and broken. UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves has announced a slew of spending cuts after detailing how the new government has inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion from previous Conservative governments. And all this is taking place as violent riots grip the country in the wake of a stabbing tragedy. Is the UK truly broke and broken? What has led the UK, the empire on which the sun never sets, to the verge of national bankruptcy? And what can be done to drag the nation out of the many crises? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Marc Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International; Nina Skero, Chief Executive of the Center for Economics and Business Research; and John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Welcome to the Dialogue. John, I will start with you. So, is the statement issued by Prime Minister Starmer's office that the country is broke and broken an exaggeration, or what?
Well, I think broken is exaggeration. Broke is not particularly an exaggeration. The situation in the UK economy is extremely serious, but it's not in the sense of an economic collapse. It's just a prolonged stagnation which is going on. If we look at the growth rate, the latest GDP figures at 0.3%, which is close to stagnation, but more urgently than simply 1 quarter or 1 year is the fact that the economy has basically been stagnant almost for a decade, and living standards have been stagnant for longer than a decade. So broken is not correct. The broke for the government finances is due to the prolonged economic stagnation of the economy. So I think stagnation, but creating therefore social and political tensions, severe ones, is the characterization I would give of the situation.
Nina, how do you characterize the situation? Is it, economically broke, but not broken?
I would agree with what we've just heard. I think the big issue is that there has been a lack of a coherent pro-growth policy, and it's very difficult to see what's going to drive economic growth in the UK and what's going to allow people here to improve their living standards in the years ahead. So I think sort of the framing around sort of a crisis, I don't think we're in a situation where there really is an acute crisis and where we're sort of, walking towards some sort of a cliff edge. But I think we are in an unenviable position, and that probably we're going to need some really big changes and decisions to get the UK on a better trajectory.
So, Marc, is there really a £22 billion overspend inherited from the Conservative? Just how damaging is it to the UK economy?
Well, it's £22 billion if you make the numbers up as in the way that Ms. Reeves has done. It's not as bad as Ms. Reeves is making out. And most importantly, she was more than aware of this before she came into power, because a lot of the information is provided via the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR as it's called. I think, in terms of what's wrong with the UK, it's a lopsided economy, which is far too reliant on its financial services. And that was an intended direction that it took about 35, 40 years ago under the Thatcher government. And which had also basically debased a lot of its manufacturing sector. But it's also got what I'd call a broken political system. The system just basically never allows for any change. If you actually look at the way the vote was structured at the last election, actually a landslide majority was achieved with the smallest vote that any government, any party has ever achieved to come into government. It's a system which basically just pendulum swings between Conservative and Labour and doesn't actually allow for any change. And without meaningful change, you're just going to carry on getting the level of dissatisfaction that we have in the UK. And you're also not actually going to see any meaningful move to make the sort of reforms which need a long-term view, which go beyond one political cycle of 5 years.
John, I wonder, how do you look at the issue of the broken political system? Do you agree that basically the political system is not delivering, despite the two parties, changing, taking their turns to run the country?
Well, I think the pattern is the same as basically in all G7 economies, all of which are relatively stagnant. The US claims it's growing dramatically fast, but it's not true. It's merely growing at about 2% a year. And the result of which is you've got rising social and political tensions in all the countries. So you've got the tremendous fight between the Democrats and Trump in the United States. You've got the rise of Le Pen in France and also left-wing parties. You've got the Alternative for Germany in Germany. You've got the rise of the Reform Party in this country. And it all reflects the underlying economic stagnation in all the G7 economies. Which is leading to great social and political tensions. So indeed, I think there's great strain in the system. The Labour landslide, as just pointed out, it's a fake landslide. They actually got less votes than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. So there's no landslide. It's just the peculiarity of the British system delivers a huge majority in Parliament. But the increase in political tensions are common to all the G7 countries. They just have a slightly different form in each one of them.
Nina, do you think, to be fair, every country suffered, let's say, from the COVID crisis, for 3 or 4 years. And of course, for European countries or Western nations, to a large point, the Ukraine conflicts also. How much damage do you think those crises, have done probably to the UK economy?
I think they've definitely done some damage. I think, one big underlying theme for a number of years has now been productivity issues in the UK. And even compared to very comparable countries, to other advanced economies, to major European players, to the United States, I think the UK has had a big productivity problem. I think, one illustrative way to put this that I always find really useful is that if compared to US workers, if the US workers stopped working at some point around mid-September, they would still produce roughly as much as UK workers working for an entire year. So I think there has been that underlying problem. And then, then the financial crisis sort of lowered that trend growth even further. And then going off that already lowered line, we've then had the energy crisis. We've had, as you mentioned, COVID. So they've all sort of taken a chip off that block. And as I said earlier, there hasn't really been a big unified effort in terms of thinking what strategically needs to be done to make up for those shortfalls.
Mm-hmm. In the low productivity, there's anything you can do probably to improve productivity?
I don't think there's a single solution you can implement. I think either underinvestment or misplaced investment, or spanning years, if not decades, have been one of the key causes for it. I think one area that the new government has done already a lot of talking in, and hopefully we'll see a lot of action in this space as well, is the UK's planning system. And I do think that a lot of productivity growth could be unlocked from that. Now, of course, the proof will be in the pudding. Let's see what actually ends up happening, because it's by no means novel to say that the UK planning and housing systems need a revamp. But the Labour government does seem to have made it probably the policy that they've put most emphasis on. And I do think there is some upside. There could be some upside growth there.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, speak of a national bankruptcy. Since 2000, probably people would remember 2 European countries have suffered such a fate. One is Greece, other is Iceland. How do you compare Britain's situation or challenges with those difficulties that two countries faced years ago?
Well, Britain is not going to go bankrupt. The people tend, when you have exaggerations, perhaps in the political system, people tend to exaggerated rhetoric. Britain is not going to go into some state of bankruptcy. Its problem is that it's essentially stagnant, and it can't do anything about this without some fundamental changes. The most fundamental thing is that its rate of investment is much too low to grow fast. I mean, if you take net fixed capital investment in the UK economy, it's only about 2% of GDP, and you can't possibly grow fast under those conditions. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a bankruptcy. There's not going to be a collapse. As I said at the beginning, I don't agree with the term broken. What there's a situation which you might call the great stagnation. That is, in my view, the best thing. If people want to use phrases which contain great because they want to make comparisons to the 1930s, and so people have talked about the financial crisis as the Great Recession, etc. My view of the situation, actually, in all the G7 countries, but in Britain included, is the great stagnation. That is, economic growth since 2007 has been lower than after 1929, if you take the same period, and there's no indication at the present time that the G7 economies are going to get out of this, and they don't really seem to be having policies which target the means whereby they could get out of this situation. So no, I don't expect bankruptcy. What I expect is a continuing stagnation. That is, the Labour government has not put forward policies which are remotely adequate to get the economy moving forward again. So it will remain locked in economic stagnation, and this will give rise to social and political tensions.
So Marc, Prime Minister Starmer's Labour Party accused the Conservative Party, which has, as we said, in 14 years of ruling, of making unfounded spending commitments to try to win public support, and described this as a quote, mess that populist politics has made of the economy and public services. In return, the Conservatives, have dismissed the accusations as a fabricated pretext for tax rise and did not disclose during the election campaign. So, Marc, which party's statements sound more reasonable to you?
I'd probably say neither, to be honest. They're both, Labour is the Chancellor Reeves' calculations are based on a number of assumptions. And she basically, I think the worst part of what she's done is pretend that she wasn't aware of this. The system basically gave her access to the OBR's calculations and all that was there. So that's a fabrication on her part. On the other hand, the Conservatives basically trying to say that this is totally not true is also incorrect. So, I don't think either I don't think either are telling the truth. And in the longer run, really what one has to look at is, does either party, and this is true, as John was saying earlier about, political systems across the G7, does either party have any ideas which go beyond the limits of the electoral cycle? And the answer is not. And that's part of the problem everywhere, but particularly in the UK. No one wants to enter into long-term projects which would benefit the economy because it doesn't benefit them politically.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, is this something we call, in the media, they call it like a conspiracy of silence? Basically both parties were aware of the, say, spending gap, and they don't talk about how they are going to implement this 10 to 20 billion pound spending, cuts, and also if they are going to raise taxes. This is for political consideration?
I think yes, but it's a silly political game because they're not addressing the underlying problems. The first underlying problem is the one which Nina pointed out, which is the question of the extremely low productivity of the UK economy. I would only add to that underneath that is the extremely low rate of investment in the economy, without which you can't generate the productivity. So they're spending their time discussing the tiny little things which really don't make very much difference. The 22 billion, frankly, in the scale of the British economy is not exactly small change, but it's not enough to derail the system. And they're not addressing the fundamental things, which is productivity, investment, and Britain's overall economic strategy. So that's the way I'd characterise. They both don't want to discuss what is the most important questions, because I don't think they've got any answers to. They have no idea what to do about it. They possibly don't even recognise what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. Nina, are we going to see tax rise by the Labour government, which promised not to tax the working people, quote, end quote there. Because obviously they are proposing some spending cuts on some of the programs, how do you think that will go with the public?
Yes, I think it's an absolute certainty that we're going to see some form of tax rises. It's been a little bit of a guessing game in terms of what shape they're going to take, because we've heard some pledges on the taxes that they won't raise, including VAT, including NICs, including income tax, which I guess is what they're collectively referring to sort of as taxes on working people. One area of taxation that I think is very likely to come under attention is CGT, which is the tax that you pay on profits if you're disposing of an asset that has appreciated. I wonder if they might do something around inheritance tax. It's a little bit hard to speculate, because there is an option of sort of raising the rates of taxation. There are also options around eliminating exceptions and eliminating reliefs. So it's hard to say, but in some way, shape or form, we are going to see increases in taxation. And I will just say that, however, this isn't sort of a bottomless, pool from which one can just always keep taking from. At some point, if you continue increasing taxes, you are getting less and less in returns, because companies will adjust their behavior, adjust their preferences. In the case of international companies, potentially even reconsider where they operate. So we will definitely see something on tax. In terms of how it will land with the public, I think since the election, we've had some consumer confidence readings, we've had some business confidence readings. I think people are sort of holding their breath. I would sort of, summarize the current situation as sort of a very low-grade, skeptical level of optimism. I think optimism coming from the fact that there was such strong dissatisfaction with the previous government, especially by the end of their time in power, that sort of any sort of change is being perceived as a good change. So I think people are a little bit holding their breath, and let's see how things actually are looking post-October. I suspect some of that room for optimism might dissipate.
We'll speak of the public response. John, adding to the country's financial challenges is the mass rioting in many cities, multiple cities in the UK, mostly in England. But the government has blamed the far-right activists, or the National Defence League, for example. But of course, they played a role. But the people will ask, is there something deeper, like societal grievances of the public?
Well, let's be clear that there hasn't been mass rioting. There had been rioting by relatively small groups of people, by which I mean some hundreds, in quite a lot of places. That's not the same as mass rioting. The turnouts which took place recently, last night, in fact, on the question of the anti-racists were actually much bigger than the rioters, but the rioters were extremely violent, and they were also extremely well organised. It's quite clear that there were the degree of targeting of where to go, the degree of synchronization, the use of social media meant that these people were very well organized and very violent. I think it reflects and then there was a big response by anti-racists as well. What this reflects is is the underlying social tension. I'm afraid that I don't think the situation is going to get better, by which I don't mean necessarily there's going to be a continuation of the short-term riots. But as long as you have this degree of social tension, you're going to have people on, you might call the right, who want to look for scapegoats. They want to blame immigrants, etc. Although immigrants don't control the British economy, so why they should be creating the problem is very obscure and known only to the ultra-right. And there will be a dissatisfaction, etc., with the government. I mean, it has a big majority in Parliament, but in my opinion, the government will become extremely unpopular rather rapidly. And it will then be replaced by a Conservative government, which will probably have been taken over by the Reform Party. I don't necessarily mean formally in the sense that Farage is the director of the Reform Party, becomes leader of the Tory Party, but I mean by Farage-type politics, and that won't solve anything either. So unless you address the underlying economic situation, you're going to continue to have these great economic and social tensions. Mm-hmm. So I would expect the situation, therefore, on that front to get worse. Not immediately, not dramatically. I can't show you the exact timescales, but that would be the general thing. Increase in social and political tensions, mm-hmm. flowing from the economic stagnation.
Right. Mark, do you agree this current disorder will somehow have a long-term impact politically? And obviously it's beyond the immigration issue?
Yeah, it goes beyond the immigration issue. To be honest, the UK has had this problem for donkey's years. You can identify any given decade, you can find someone scapegoating a group of migrants, whether it was in the 50s and 60s, it was people from the Caribbean. In the 70s, it was the Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and those from East Africa. In the 80s, it was Australians and Kiwis. From the 90s onwards, it was Central and Eastern Europeans. This is, there's a long history of this in the UK, and it's basically it's because there's always someone who is foreign who's to blame for the UK's problems when most of them are homemade. The point you were raising earlier about, spending cuts, the most damaging ones throughout the post-World War II history of the UK is every time there's a downturn in the economy, there is a sort of dogma that the first thing you strike out is infrastructure projects. And this is exactly what the Labour Party is doing. It's not actually anything Labour or Conservative, it's just Treasury dogma. And that's where, this weakness in productivity, the low skills base, is all related to not improving the infrastructure. And if you always basically cut infrastructure spending, you're basically going to end up where we are now, and a lot of dissatisfaction.
Well, Mark, what do you suggest the government should do beyond the spending cut, beyond tax rises, to challenge or to deal with the challenges? Long-term challenges, so to kickstart the economy.
Well, my view for at least 10 or 11 years since we introduced this whole idea of quantitative easing, that you should basically set up a UK infrastructure and investment bank, something along the lines of KfW in Germany, the Bank for Reconstruction, which was set up after the government, to basically seed fund a lot of investment in the UK's infrastructure and broad sectors of the economy, to improve the skills base, to improve transport, to improve education, and at the same time encourage others, whether they're domestic investors or foreign investors, to invest in it. But there never seems to be anyone actually wanting to take anything as bold a move on that because, as I said earlier, they don't see any political gain for themselves, and that's also a problem across the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nina, the Chancellor Reeves, I believe it said last year that globalization as we know it is dead. And recently she talked to journalists in the US, on a tour, talked about rebuilding ties with nations, sharing values, for example, with the European Union, with the United States, with Canada. Is this the way to revitalize the economy, probably with more trade, more investment?
I think on their relationship with the EU, there has a lot of work has gone into getting the post-Brexit relationship even to the point where it is currently at. They have identified a few sort of small areas where they want to make progress relating to, for example, veterinary certificates on food trade, some things in the arts and culture space, and people traveling internationally in that sector. So, very sort of bite-sized, achievable targets. I again wonder if they overestimate the speed with which these things move and just how much work has gone in on behalf of the UK civil service into getting sort of those agreements to the status quo. And then looking sort of further abroad, the relationship with the US, obviously a very important one, a little bit hard to predict how that will look, given that the US, of course, has its own big election coming up in the autumn. And then, I think in terms of the relationship between China and the UK, hopefully a little bit of a relationship, a little bit of an opportunity for a relationship reset, perhaps, although those are two sometimes difficult relationships for countries to navigate, the one with the US and the one in China, given the many complexities of those two powerful forces and the relationship they have with each other.
Mm-hmm. Joan, what do you think of the remarks by Chancellor Reeves? She's talking about stronger links with the countries with similar values, but also he mentioned about the Gulf states. So can we say global Britain remains alive? What do you think about, as Nina mentioned, a reset of China-Britain relationship? China probably is ready, or more than ready, to do more investment in the country.
The global Britain was complete nonsense slogan. I mean, there was never going to be a global Britain. All it did was it cut itself off from its largest market, or made it more difficult to trade with its largest market, that is Europe. And then it's continuing to do various irrational things from the point of view of China. Because, for example, cutting out Huawei, which had been an excellent provider for the British telecommunications system for many, many years, simply resulted in the fact that 5G in Britain became more expensive and arrived later. Also, Cameron had a relatively rational position, which was Chinese companies want to go international. London is the most important international centre in the West, apart from New York, the only one that's comparable to New York. And Chinese companies should have been setting up their company headquarters internationally in London, but that was squelched by the subsequent governments. So there's just a lot of thrashing around going on the question of international policy. There's no coherent policy at all, because the one coherent thing that could be done, which would be to re-establish links with the EU, for example, through membership of the single market. If you don't want to have full membership of the EU, the government won't do because it thinks it'd be unpopular. So therefore, there's not any rational policy that's going to do, and they're not going to improve their relations with China, unfortunately, because the US doesn't want it. And therefore, the international relations of Britain will continue to be a mess. I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but it is a rather sad and very difficult situation. And the international aspects of it are one part of that. The governments, as long as they won't address the major problems in the country, they're not going to solve any problems. I mean, Einstein defined madness as doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. Well, all they're doing at the moment is they're repeating the same thing and they're hoping for a different outcome, and they'll get exactly the result which Einstein predicted, that is, there won't be any change.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.